Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Gretchen Wall, the coordinator for the Produce Safety Alliance. I have 2 o'clock on my watch, so I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the Produce Safety Educators Call. This is actually number 35 that we've hosted. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get into the presentation. Everyone for now is going to be on mute just because we do anticipate a larger crowd, and we will have some time for questions at the end, but feel free to also use the chat box if you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, and we'll do our best to get around to those questions during the call, or we can follow up with you after the call. We will be recording this meeting as usual, and we will post it on our website. If you haven't been to our website before and you're new to this call, we actually have all of our educators' calls recorded, and those recordings along with meeting notes posted on our website. So you can catch up on all the previous topics that we've hosted and presentations that we've had along the way. But I do my best to make sure that these get up and on the website as quickly as possible. So if you have to dip out in the middle of the presentation, it will be recorded, and we will get that up on the website as soon as possible. So today we're really excited for the particular topic. I know I got a lot of emails after this went out through our general listserv newsletter last Friday about the topic of sanitizers. I know there's a lot of questions about post-harvest sanitizers in particular for fruits and vegetables. So we are very fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Amanda Deering, who's a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Food Science at Purdue. And Dr. Deering has earned her Bachelor's of Science in Biology, her Master's in Plant Biology from Central Michigan University. And she also completed her PhD at Purdue in Food Micro and Food Safety, specializing in plants and fresh produce. She also has research interests focusing on examining internalization of human pathogenic bacteria in plants and various routes of contamination that can contribute to plants harboring pathogenic bacteria. And she works in the development of novel post-harvest sanitizers for the reduction of bacteria on fresh produce. In her extension work, she works directly with the fresh produce industry and has vast experience with good manufacturing practices, good agricultural practices, and also post-harvest processing operations. And she's a lead team member of the Safe Produce Indiana program. In addition, Dr. Deering works internationally with the Purdue Afghanistan team that's developing a university system in agriculture in the war-torn country, along with Dr. Haley Oliver. They're training students and faculty about food safety and how they can teach others. In addition to Dr. Deering's presentation today, at the end of this call, Donna Pahl Clements is going to highlight some of the PSA's sanitizer resources. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Deering, and I'm going to unmute you, and if you want, you can there you go, ask for the controls, and hopefully you'll be able to advance these slides here.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gretchen, for that introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I was asked if I would talk on this subject, and I do have to admit, I do not do regulatory, so everything I have learned is from the regulatory side, and we do research on it. But really what I want to do is give you a background on what some of these sanitizers are, some of the regulatory things that we as educators need to know, and then kind of just talk through what growers really need to know as far as sanitizers. And this is a very, very confusing topic, I think, for all of us involved. So hopefully today I'll be able to answer at least some of the questions and provide more insight into this topic. So I actually teach a food plants sanitation course, and so this morning, just by chance, we talked about sanitizers. So this was going to be kind of my second take at this today. So we always start out with what's the purpose of sanitizing? And so really it's a hygienic measure used to ensure the food that we produce is as safe as possible, right? So we use sanitizers not only for sanitizing fruits and vegetables, but we also use it to sanitize any food contact surfaces, right? And the goal is to reduce microorganisms that are present. And so it's important because sanitizers have such a wide role of things that we can use them for, I am going to talk more into how you decide the best sanitizer for your particular purpose. And really good sanitizers, the industry will say a 3 to 5 log reduction. And 5 log would be pretty optimistic. You know, really we usually fall into that 3 log reduction, especially when we're talking fruit and vegetable sanitizers. Yep. So this log reduction, this gets kicked around, this term, all the time. Us in the microbiology world, we love to talk about things in log scales, but really what does that mean? And so 1 log reduction is 90% reduction of the total bacteria that's present. So if you start off, if you have, say we have 10,000 bacteria, you had a 1 log reduction to 1,000, that would be a 90% reduction. 2 log 99, 3 log 99.9, and so on. So this is really what we're talking about. So when you hear these log reduction numbers, this is what, you know, we're basing it on, these numbers. And the other thing that especially I tell my students too, when you use a sanitizer, you almost never will get rid of everything that's present. So sometimes I think we think about it, well, I sanitized it, so there's no bacteria, and that's never going to be the case. I mean, there'll always be some that will be present after the process. So why use sanitizers? So I do always tell my growers too, using a sanitizer is not completely required, and I'll talk about this later. So it's mostly the buyers will tell you if they want a sanitizer to be used or not. And especially when you're having fruits and vegetables coming in from different areas, it's really good to clean up the water too, because that is really going to help reduce any cross-contamination that we could have from, you know, so one cantaloupe, for example, is contaminated. It's not going to contaminate everything else that came in contact with it. So they're a really good idea, and not even, I also put in here too, it's not always just from the human pathogenic bacteria standpoint, it's also from the spoilage. All right, so the industry really cares. We obviously don't want to make anyone sick, but getting an extra day or 2 of shelf life is really, really important. Right, so the longer that product can sit on the shelves in the grocery store to be sold, the better. Right, so yes, we don't want to make people sick, but we also really care about increasing the shelf life. And a lot of these sanitizers that are out there today, especially these peroxyacetic acid based ones, are really good at extending shelf life. So again, this is really just what I said in the previous slide, but it's important. And just the picture down in the below, although it's not a great one, you know, this is stuff the industry deals with all the time. So a huge volume of product that's going to go through to be sanitized. And so really you want to make sure that we use these sanitizers and then we use them in the correct way, right? And this is the other thing I tell the growers I work with. If you don't do it right, you can screw up a lot of things too if you're doing it wrong. So washing is a great thing, and especially washing using sanitizers, you know, that's a great thing. But if you don't do it right, you can cause a lot of problems as well. So some buyers don't require a wash step, and that's fine. And I tell them, you know, if they don't require it, that you don't have to do it, but it's their call. I also tell people if it helps you sleep better at night, then absolutely you should do it. So sanitizers, at the end of the day, they're actually considered a pesticide, right? And so a pesticide is any substance or mixture of substances that you're trying to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate a pest. And so in our case, when we think about on the food safety side, right, we're thinking about pathogenic microorganisms. And so those are our pests. So a lot of times we think of pesticides as insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, but they also include these sanitizers, right? Because at the end of the day, what we want to do is decrease the number of bacteria, spoilage, or pathogenic that we have present. So under United States law, we do consider sanitizers as a pesticide. So again, what we don't want, we don't often think of bacteria as a pest, but in our case, and what we're dealing with on the produce food safety side, that's exactly what it is, right? So we're trying to decrease those that are present. So it's really important just to keep that in your mindset. And I think once you think of it like that, having all this EPA regulation actually makes a lot more sense. At least it did to me. If you don't think about it as a pesticide, having all these things regulated the way they are doesn't really make that much sense. So anyway, just think about that as a pesticide. So I often tell people the story and how I got more into this is I had worked, with sanitizers for years in the fresh cut industry. And, worked on developing new sanitizers and whatnot. And then I was asked, well, what sanitizers can I use for post-harvest processing of fruits and vegetables in Indiana? And I said, well, I don't actually know which ones, but surely that exists, right? There's a list somewhere that I can pull up and I can send to you. And it will tell you everything, all the products that you can use. And that I found was very wrong, that it didn't exist. And so that's how I kind of got into really trying to understand and make it easy for growers, to give them a handout. And this is what Donna has been working on as well. Give them something, a resource where they can just look, it tells you what you can use, they can pull up the product label, and it gives you all the information. So we started this in Indiana, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and have kept that list since. So it was not easy doing. It was quite the process. But once we got it down, and once we understood all the regulatory aspects, it made it a lot easier, and something now that we just have that as a resource for Indiana growers, which can be easily modified for other states as well. And I'll talk about what that means. So really what we're going to talk about today is how to identify if a sanitizer can be used, what a product label should tell you, who to contact if you have questions regarding post-harvest sanitizers. And then briefly, I'm going to touch on testing sanitizer concentrations. And this is, it's important to test those sanitizer concentrations so you know what you're working with. But also, if any of the growers you're working with, if they're going through a third-party audit, and this has been really true in the last couple of years anyway, from my experience, if it's a USDA audit, whatever, they are going to ask you, they're going to ask the grower to show, if you say you're using a 50 parts per million, whatever, they're going to say, show me how you know it's 50 parts per million. And this has come up time and time again, at least for us in Indiana in the last couple of years with our growers that we work with who are getting third-party audits. So I'm going to touch on that. Again, there's so many different sanitizers and so many different ways to test what those concentrations are. I'm not going to go into much detail, but that's something you can also send me an email or call, and we can talk about that if you have a specific question. So I kind of touched on this. So all our post-harvest sanitizers are regulated by EPA. And so what they do is, so if a company wants, and I've helped several companies through this process, they get the data that shows, so they do toxicity data, so they know how the product works, that it kills bacteria and not us, and they'll look at how if it's safe to use, what are all the environmental questions, they will have all that data. And so they'll review that. It's not a cheap date to actually get a sanitizer EPA approved, to get through that whole system. But once they do, they're good to go. And so this is something they renew this. I'm not exactly sure. I don't know if it's every year. I might be, but they do have to renew these at least on some basis. So it's not a one and done either, which I think is important because they can go back and just make sure that everything was correct. So in addition, and this is where it totally, I guess, caught me out in the very beginning too, is that post-harvest sanitizers, they have to be registered with EPA and they have to be approved for use in the state they're being used. So in Indiana, we're our way our government is structured is a lot different than most states. So we actually have the Office of the Indiana State Chemists, and they're the ones who regulate all of our post-harvest sanitizers. And I just have Ohio. I've worked with Ohio on some of these developing lists. So it's their Department of Ag, and that's probably more common. So that's something I don't know. Each state, who would be the regulatory, but asking at the Department of Ag probably would be a good start. But like I said, we have ours through the Office of the Indiana State Chemist. And so in Indiana anyway, we update these every year. So if you do make a list, this is something you have, which is easy. You go in, you check once a year, make sure that they have renewed their approval for use in Indiana, and you just update your sanitizer list to reflect that. So this is the National Pesticide Information Retrieval System, and so this is actually maintained at Purdue, where at least it's housed at Purdue, like to say that. So you'll see that these states that are in blue, they participate in this registration system. So you can go to their website, you can actually pick your state. If you clicked on your state of interest, there's a searchable database there, and you can actually search in there for the sanitizer. If you're looking to see if one that you have, if it's approved, you can actually go in there and check that out. This is free to do most things that you would want to do, you can do for the free. But if you want greater access, so it'll give you some more information on the chemicals and whatnot, there is a fee. And I don't remember the exact number. I think it was like $250 a year or something. There is a fee. But I use this all the time. So if a grower or somebody calls me and says, hey, can I use this sanitizer? This is my first stop. You click on your state, you put in, I ask them, what's your EPA registration number? You put it in and it'll pop up if it's registered in your state. So really easy to use. So I will say then, so these states that are in gray, it doesn't mean they don't have an approval system. So I know Illinois, for example, they maintain a list of things that are approved sanitizers. They just don't participate in this program. So again, so these states, if you are in a gray state or know working with somebody in a gray state, that information is still there. And then the yellow ones just aren't updated as often. But so anyway, this is a great resource. I use this, like I said, all the time. So every product, so the first step, I tell people, the first step, if you want to decide whether or not this is a sanitizer for you to use, you want to check that it has an EPA registration number on the label, right? And all this means is that if you use this product the way it says to use it, it won't kill you. That's the gist of it. And so it's not going to pose unreasonable health effects, whatnot. Again, if you use it according to the label, right? So this isn't, the typical is, well, if a little's good, a lot's better. Yeah, well, a lot could be very harmful. So especially breathing in, some of these things are pretty nasty, is the fumes that they give off. And especially if you're mixing things, which you never should do, you can cause some pretty nasty reactions. So you want to make sure you definitely are looking at that EPA or using it according to what the label says. So if an EPA number is not clearly visible on the product, that's a red flag to me. You know, and I go to a lot of these trade shows, or people will contact me all the time wanting me to test their sanitizer, getting some data. And if it doesn't have an EPA number, that's a red flag, right? So there's something that, you know, there's something not right, right? So you want to question that one. So maybe it's just that the label, which the number should be on the label, but you can also contact the manufacturer. So if you don't see it on there, contact the manufacturer, and then they should be able to give it to you. And so then all these numbers, there's a link. If you want to search for a product through EPA, you can search everything by the EPA registration number. So that's just for you, for your information. So these logos, and I see this all the time, they do not replace an EPA number, right? And I've had this USDA certified bio-based product, okay? I've had sanitizer sent to me that has this label. I don't even know what that means. So if you see that, this doesn't replace anything. And I also see where they'll say it's FDA grass. So grass is generally regarded as safe, and that's an FDA term, right? So EPA would never in a million years use an FDA term, right? They're gonna have their own term for that. So if you see things like this is another red flag, and I see a lot of them like that. So you just wanna be careful, look for the EPA number, you know, and this other stuff, it doesn't replace anything. And half of it, I don't even know what they mean sometimes. It's kind of like the feel good things. So there are, however, about 30 compounds that do not have to be registered with EPA. And so these are ones that they feel are safe, that they're not going to pose a threat. However, if you come across with somebody's labeling as a sanitizer, and it's one of these 30 compounds, they cannot bear a claim. So they can't say kills 99% of Listeria monocytogenes, right? Because that's bearing a health claim. So these products cannot do that. And they only can contain that one product. So it can't be, I'll show you this. Let me just go to this next slide here. So these are the products, and they can only contain these products, right? So it can't be, 90% sodium hypochlorite and with a splash of rosemary oil, right? That's not what this is. So they're going to be made up of just these compounds. And some are questionable. I've always questioned the dried blood one, and why anybody would ever want to use any of these things. But these are okay. So if someone sold you, they could say it's a sanitizer, that's mint oil. So these likely would not have an EPA label then, because they wouldn't have to go through that registration process, because they're these 30 exempt products. So you could have this. I would say the likelihood of you coming across something like this is pretty low. But these essential oils, there's been a lot of research probably in the last 2 to 3 years of how these work and how they're beneficial. And so they may come across it, but then these likely may not have a registration number. All right, so let's just go through. What I did was pull a couple labels and just kind of go through and what are we looking for, right? So like I said, the first thing that I'm going to do if I'm looking at this sanitizer label, I'm going to look for the EPA registration number, right? And I find it right away. So it's clearly there. We know that this is a proxyacetic acid based product. It's telling us what is in there. Those are probably the two most important things on here. And it's just giving you some idea of what the product is like. It's a liquid, it's colorless, so you can get that information. But probably what's in it and that percent of what it is and the EPA number are probably the most important. So what does this EPA registration number mean? And I was sort of confused when I started this, because you would see these ones that would have, so for example, this X and Y, and then you would have some other sanitizers that would be this, have a third set of numbers in there. And really all this is, so that first set is your company ID portion. So each company will have a specific number to that. And then the second, the Y numbers, would be that product ID portion, right? So that's telling you what that product actually is. And then the last one is the distributor suffix. So that's just basically somebody who repackages that chemical. So I always explain to people, you know, it's like going in and seeing a Kroger brand, whatever there is, salad mix versus Dole or whatever. You know, they could be made at the exact same place, but they're just labeled a different way. And so that's what that EPA number means. So it's just the private label. So you can also find the EP numbers, and information about the products can be found on this pesticide product label system. Again, that's housed by EPA, and it will give you all the information, more information than probably you ever want to know. But you can search it by product name, company name, or EPA registration number, and so that will bring up that info. So if you ever need a label, so if someone, you know, brings you a product and you want to get, because sometimes, you know, those labels can be small on a bottle, and all of the information is not necessarily just on that bottle, right? So you can always go back and search and get all of the product information if you search on the EPA website. Okay, so products that have the same EPA registration number should have the same ingredients, right? So there shouldn't be a difference. And so that's sometimes why you will see, so those first two sets of numbers will be the same, and they'll only differ by that last set. And unfortunately, what happens in the produce world in these post-harvest sanitizers is that, you know, when we have a chlorine-based sanitizer, half of them are the exact same chemical that's labeled for chlorine that you put in your swimming pool, right? And they'll charge $2 for the bottle of chlorine that you put in your swimming pool, and they're going to charge you $50 for the post-harvest sanitizer one. And that's because they can. And so I get that asked all the time. It's like, it's the exact same thing. Why can't I use this swimming pool chlorine? And that's the reason why, because they don't have a label on that $2 bottle. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. But they don't have a label that says you can use it to wash fruit and vegetables. And the one that says you can use it for fruits and vegetables costs more, because they can charge more. And so that's the bummer side of the whole thing, but that unfortunately is the case. So whatever we're using, it doesn't matter if it's the same chemistry, it has to be labeled for that use. Okay, so here's an example of an EPA registration number, and this is another proxyacetic acid based product. And if I look in Indiana, there's over 20 products that are registered. If I just look for that is that same EPA number, right? So this one over, I may be able to say, for example, I'm not saying this is true, but say I can use this one to wash fruits and vegetables, but this one I can't. And so they're the same product, but this one I would have to read the label where it says to be able to wash fruits and vegetables, and then this WC 237 I can't. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that too in a second. So it is confusing, but that's kind of the way it is. Right, so this is what I just said. So the label must give use rates for post-harvest processing of fruits and vegetables. So how they state that can sort of vary in between how they get to the point. So it might say for post-harvest washing, it may say specifically fruits and vegetables, but it has to have that language in there somehow. So it has to say something about post-harvest and something about fruits and vegetables. So the other words that they have in there really don't matter as long as it has those things in there. So yeah, so this is quite busy and sort of hard to read. But again, this is that Tsunami 100. And this is what this label should tell you, right? So it should tell you the directions for use. And this is exactly how you're going to use them. I mean, should be really not much deviation from this. And so it's going to tell you how you mix it up. It's going to tell you what's your contact time. So how long do you leave the sanitizer in contact with the produce? Do I have to rinse it off? Is there a wash stub afterwards? It'll tell you. It'll give you all that information, right? And even here you can see they're saying a 99.9% reduction of E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella, right? So they did the research, they're making that health claim in there. And again, that's to sell the product. They want you to know how good it is, essentially, but they can definitely put that in there. So yeah. Okay, so what this label should tell you, and these are the things that you're looking for. And I sort of get hung up. I actually like reading product labels. I know it's weird, but I like to see them just how they present them differently too. It's kind of, it's dorky, but so what the label should tell you is the concentration for use and how to dilute it, the contact time. It may tell you, it doesn't have to though. It should say something about what the organisms that it kills. So there should be some language to that. It should tell you if I need to rinse it. So like a chlorine or chlorine dioxide based product, you need a final rinse step. It needs to tell you that's what you need to do. I should tell you how to dispose of the products in the containers after you've done, and any first aid procedures, right? So all that information should be in that label. And again, some of these, right, these bottles can be small and the labels can be small. So they may not have that on that actual bottle, but you can go to and pull the label off from EPA and get this other information. This is all pretty, this is pretty important information. So I would think most of this kind of stuff, maybe not the killing Listeria monocytogenes, but that would be on the bottle. But sometimes it'll say also, please contact, whatever their customer service to get more of that information, and you certainly can do that. So here's another example. So again, this is off the Tsunami label. They're telling you how great it is, right? So here's all the benefits of using our product. And this is what we want you to know. There's no pH control necessary. There's no rinse required. It's telling you all the latest and greatest things to do with this product. And again, so here's the health claim. So they've done the research. They know it reduces, so it's a 3-log reduction, a 99.9% reduction of E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella. And so this is to sell it, right? They're saying if you use this product, this is what you would expect. And here's another example. This is just a chlorine example, Chlorguard. And so this will tell you, so the first thing we're looking for, right, is that EPA number. So we're going to come down here, and there it is. So that's great. We know it's a registered product. The second thing we're going to look for is what is this? So it's sodium hypochlorite, it's a chlorine solution, and we know what that concentration is, right? So this doesn't tell us yet that we can actually use this for fruit and vegetable washing. It gives you some hints here, but this is not a label where it says it can be used for fruits and vegetables. But then if you keep going into the label itself, it gives you the directions. So it says for fruit and vegetable wash, here's what you do. And some of these labels will split it apart depending on the type of fruit and vegetable you're using. So there may be, say, a different concentration for a cantaloupe versus a tomato or whatever. I'm just making that up. But so some will do that. So again, sometimes you have to worry about what the product is, or someone just give a general fruit and vegetable wash, right? So either way, it's totally fine. And it's telling me how I would dilute it, and what that final part per million is. Most of these things will deal with, you'll see those numbers in parts per million, but it should give you how to do the actual dilution as well. And then it's giving me the environmental hazards. So it's saying don't dump this in a stream behind your packing house. Make sure you take care of it the way it says. And you can get guidance on, so this would be environmental things. So you can get guidance on how to, if you have questions, each state is going to be a little bit different. So you can ask how they regulate that and get that information. So again, it's telling you storage and disposal. These are all things that we want to know. Storing a cool, dry area away from direct sunlight. That whole direct sunlight thing, I see a lot of these old bottles that look like they've been in the sun for years and years and years, and I don't think they're probably the same concentration as what they started out with. And then it's going to give you the first aid, right? So here's what you do if any of these things happen. All right, so again, this is all information that they should provide to you. So once a product is registered with the EPA, it also needs to be registered in the state you're using it. So like I said, ours is the Indiana State Chemist, or Office of the Indiana State Chemist, but it would just depend on your state. Most will be the Departments of Ag, probably that you would have or be able to find that information. And again, you can go to this website and it lists it out by state. You can search by your state and find out if a particular product is one that can be used. So again, we made this approved sanitizer for fruits and vegetables, and I think Donna will talk about the ones that the PSA has developed, and I think they're going to be great resources to give to your growers as you work with them. But again, I think it's just a process, and so you want to go through and make sure when you pick a sanitizer first, just check if you can use it to, if it says you can use it to wash fruits and vegetables. That's for post-harvest, right? If you want it for a food contact surface, it needs to say it's for a food contact surface. So however you want to use that, it just has to give you directions to be able to use it in that way. So measuring concentrations. So like I said, I guess I didn't really notice the third-party auditors really asking a lot about sanitizers up until a few years ago. And it seems, they will ask to see the label of the sanitizer. So if there's not that information on the bottle, I've been there when that's happened. They definitely want to know, how are you measuring? So if you say I'm using 200 parts per million, how do you know that? How do you know it's 200 parts per million? And so they are going to want to see that, at least, I guess I have never heard, and that could be, you guys may have heard others, but all the people I worked with, they've never had to show they actually can do it, but they need to have that test strip there. And so some of this can be daunting as well. So if we go, so these are all just different. This is for PAA, so peroxyacetic acid base, a Hawk meter. So we kind of use all these things in the lab. So a Hawk meter for chlorine or chlorine dioxide. This is like an old school titration kit. It works pretty well, but you have to be willing to put up with adding drop by drop to figure out what that concentration is. And none of these are perfect. There's always a little wiggle room in any of these, but they need to make sure they have something. And so most often these test strips seem to work fine. And so a lot of the growers, I will find these. So the companies usually will sell these these test strips, but you can almost always find them on Amazon. I think I have that in the next slide. But you may also need to measure pH as well. And so some of the sanitizers, in particular, chlorine is probably the most finicky of all of them. You need to keep it, within, 6.5, 7. You get much above 7.5, and you're going to start losing efficacy. But something like chlorine dioxide, that's good from 4 to 9, a pH of 4 to 9, maybe even higher. So it just depends on what the sanitizer you're using, but make sure you have these things available. And you can definitely, the companies will provide guidance, but you certainly can find cheaper options out there, particularly on Amazon. And so I always put this as an example because I've seen this so many times that, you know, so they have a test strip or they'll have a Hawk meter, and, you know, it's the super end of this, it's the darkest blue or the darkest red, whatever, and they'll say, well, see, it's 160 parts per million. And it's like, well, no, that could be 160. It also could be 500 parts per million, right? So not only do we have to teach, you know, these are the things you use, but show the limitations to some of these. So, I mean, a Hawk meter is great. You can really, it measures those concentrations really well, but you have to know what the cutoff is. You know, so I've had people, you go into a packing house and the chlorine dioxide is almost, you can barely breathe, and they'll say, well, no, see, it's 5 parts per million. And they were using a Hawk meter, but the cutoff was 5 parts per million. So it was probably about 30 parts per million that was being run. So you just have to make sure that, you know, there are limitations with these things and that people are aware that these limitations are there. So just some final thoughts. Ask the sanitizer manufacturer for recommendations. Every single manufacturer will tell you theirs is the best and the best thing since sliced bread, right? So that's where, you know, you can do some of your research or ask people. Certainly you can ask opinions of other people to find out, but they'll give you a good starting point anyway. And, you know, you can purchase a lot of these things on Amazon. And so I was thinking here more of test strips and things like that. But again, just make sure whatever you're buying, that it's approved for that use and it's approved in the state for that use. If, like I said, growers will need to have these test strips if they're going to do a third-party audit. I think it's just becoming one of those things that people know to ask now, and so it is important. And I get that asked all the time, do growers have to use post-harvest sanitizers? And the answer is no. I mean, so it depends on what the buyer wants. If the buyer's saying, I'm not buying this unless it's been washed and with the sanitizer, then that's what you have to do if you want to sell to this person. But I always say things can be made worse, especially with cross-contamination, if what you think you're doing is right and it's not. So by washing it, you can make a lot of things worse. So if people are going to go down that path, I think it's good to invest the time and look and make sure you know what you're doing and what are some of the challenges. So that's all I have. There's my contact information. So always feel free to give me a call or send me an email. I'm always happy to talk sanitizers with somebody. So, and again, a lot of this information that I got, most of it came from working with people at the Office of the Indiana State Chemist. So again, we don't do any regulatory, but they are the ones who really educated me on what these things mean. So I'm happy to pass along any information that I have to other educators as well. All right, well, thank you guys. I appreciate the time and look forward to your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Amanda, for that awesome presentation. I came up with a couple of questions just as you were talking, and while people are kind of formulating their own questions, it's just a reminder that you can either use the chat box to enter in a question to us and we'll get to it that way, or you can, I've given you all permission to unmute yourselves, so you should be able to do that through your computer. If you've called in and you're not logged into a computer, I believe you can also use *6 to mute and unmute yourself. I've never actually tried it, but I believe that should work to unmute your line. So while you guys are thinking about your questions, one of the things I was thinking about at the end of your presentation, Amanda, was about the actual ways that you measure sanitizers, and you were showing some pictures of different strips and varying concentrations that they can measure. But one of the things that we get asked questions about, or I see that happens pretty frequently, is those expiration dates on things like the dip strips, and people using those that are out of the actual expiration date. So I didn't know if you've had any experience with that, but I think that's just one best practice that I was going to mention, was to pay attention to those dates.
Yeah, that's a very good point, for sure. I mean, we have used them past their expiration date. I mean, not long, and they do give similar results, but that's a very good point. I think for the best results possible, you want to make sure that they have not expired, because that could definitely be, the results could definitely be different. That's a very good point.
Yeah, we had some New York educators that I believe were testing some out-of-date strips and found that it varied pretty dramatically in terms of the color change. And those things are very hard to distinguish anyway, unless you've got an art degree in certain cases. So with that, I open it up to other questions from people on the call. There's nearly 100 people on this phone call, and I'm sure there's questions out here. So there's now is your opportunity to either do so through the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself and just let us know your name and who you are. And I'm sure Amanda would be happy to answer your question. Okay, everyone on the phone lines are being shy, but I did get one through the chat box from Atina, and she asked, a lot of farmers ask me if they should use chlorine products for contact surfaces and peroxyacetic acid sanitizers for the water in dunk tanks. Do you have research to indicate that it is better to use a chlorine product for contact surfaces?
No. What I have seen through our research, for increasing shelf life, the peroxyacetic acid-based products seem to do really well. But as far as food contact surfaces, no, either way. And a lot of people are going to something like a Sanidate or something along those lines, because they have labels for all those. They have for food contact, they have for fruit and vegetable washing. So it's just easier to have one product. And so no, I don't have any personal research that one is better than the other. I think as long as you use it the way it says on the label, you should be good to go. Oh, so there's another question. The difference between Sanidate. So someone asked, what is the difference between Sanidate 5.0 versus Sanidate 12.0? And that's this initial concentration. So the Sanidate 12.0 will be a higher concentration than the Sanidate 5.0. As far as I know, anyway. I don't know. I think there's any other difference between those products.
So another question that came in was about that Cal has seen literature saying chlorine can be at 3 parts per million in a dump tank and effective, where in other cases 50 to 150 parts per million can be effective. Do you have any thoughts?
Definitely, just based on any of the research we've done, definitely the higher concentration is better. So you're going to get a better kill of bacteria at the higher concentrations. However, that sanitizer needs to be labeled as such, right? So if you have a sanitizer and it's saying 3 parts per million, you want to make sure you use it at 3 parts per million. But everything we've done is the higher the concentration that you can use, the better.
Okay, there was another question that came in about how do we best communicate that pH requirement for bleach, since a lot of the times that pH requirement doesn't often appear on the label. Does that mean that those particular products, the pH isn't really important to monitor, or are they stabilized in some way that kind of buffers the pH? You know, how do we navigate that with the growers that ask questions when they see that on the label?
Yeah, so and actually this is Don, I see him on the line. We've actually talked about this. So and that's one of the, I guess I don't have the best answer. So if it doesn't say that it has to be at a certain pH, then the label is what it is. And we know though from working with these. There's lots of research done, so if you're off of that, that concentration, then it can impact just how well the bacteria get killed. And so, that's one of those things. I guess I don't have a great answer. All I would say though, if it doesn't say you need to do it, I mean, then that's the label. There's not. But the problem is then you could be wasting a lot of product as well, right? Which we don't want to do because that's wasting money. It's expensive. So I don't know. That's not a great answer. I guess I would contact the company, would probably be what I would do in that case, and just ask them that question. Should I be monitoring the pH? And if they say no, I don't know that any of these guys are using buffers or anything for the pH, not to my knowledge. But I guess that would be a manufacturer question.
Okay, and just so you know, Don did tee you up for that one. So he's apparently been continuing to think about it. So I think that's a great suggestion. Contact the manufacturer.
Yeah, and that's a very good question.
Yeah. Okay, I've seen a couple other great questions come in through the chat box. So this one is about, it's more of a comment, but maybe you can do your best elevator speech about this, Amanda. The need to discriminate between measurements of free chlorine versus total chlorine.
Right. So what we want to measure is the free available chlorine. And I hope I'm getting this right. So it's the free available chlorine. That's the one that's actually doing the killing. And so most of the test strips you have will give you, unfortunately, a lot of them measure total chlorine. But what we're interested in, and I'm pretty sure the Hach meter will already makes that adjustment, is so the free available chlorine is what is available to kill the bacteria that are present. So that's the efficacy end of things. And that's a good point too. So to make sure that you're using the right strip for the right job. So that was good.
Yeah, and I've seen that quite a bit, and that's one of the things that I have a little kit that I drag around to my grower trainings where I bring examples of free chlorine strips and total chlorine strips just so people can see that there is a difference. And I think you're spot on with, the free available chlorine is what you're trying to measure, but it's really important if you're going to go to an ag supply store or purchase that from an online retailer that you take a good look and make sure that you're measuring the free available chlorine, not just the total.
Right. That is correct.
Okay. Next question here, another one from Atina. Do peroxyacetic acid sanitizers have generic test strips? My understanding is that they should be bought specific for the brand, whereas chlorine products can use generic test strips. Do you have any thoughts on this?
No, we've actually tested a bunch of those. So like that one I had in my demonstration, or in the pictures there, and then we tested that compared to that titration kit versus there's some others that it will actually give you a number. So you put the test strip in there and you put it in this little, it's like a handheld thing, and it'll give you a number, and they're all about the same. So it doesn't, you can buy, as long as it's saying it's measuring is for PAA, and make sure some of these have the ranges too. So you'll see some of these ranges are up to 160, some get cut off at like 10, which is okay, right? You can still dilute, you mix up your final and then dilute it down to a concentration that will work for your test strip. I mean, so that's okay, but just keep that in mind, right? So some of these that only go up to 10, they're going to be that dark blue color, no matter it's 10 and over, right? It doesn't mean it's just 10 parts per million. Does that answer?
I think that should, well, from my opinion, I think that answers the question, but we'll see if that scratches the itch for Atina. She can either unmute herself or comment in the chat box, but I'm going to go back up because I know we're getting a ton of questions, which is fantastic. Go back up to the questions that have been submitted. One of the questions is actually it's a little bit outside the scope of this webinar, but it's definitely something that I've been asked in trainings before, so I think it might be relevant to everybody, is about microbial resistance when talking or when using chlorine products, because should growers be rotating products occasionally? Is that really a concern? And there's a sort of a similar question submitted by somebody else down the line that, you know, how do you address farmers who believe sanitizers are bad because they will reduce the produce benefits to human intestinal biodiversity? So kind of slightly similar ideas, but do you have any thoughts on that?
So what was the first part? What was that again?
So the first question was about microbial resistance and should growers be switching up the sanitizers that they use?
Okay, so I've actually had a lot of discussions with the produce industry, so thinking like the Doles and whatnot on this subject, because I think that's what, so if you look at a large majority of the fresh cut industry, they're all running chlorine because it works and it's cheap. And they're constantly looking for new sanitizers, but it's that they work and it's cheap. They can't get past that. And so that is a concern that you could have resistance. So we know, like E. coli, for example, there's acid resistant or acid tolerant, anyway, E. coli from the meat manufacturing side. I mean, we've seen this happen. And so this is always a concern, you know, could we end up with bacteria that are chlorine tolerant? And so I guess it could, but, you know, the fresh cut industry has been using chlorine forever. And, you know, I don't, at this point, I wouldn't, I guess, recommend a grower that they have to switch up what they're using all the time. We have, though, I will say, we've seen good results when you use a combination of products. So say running chlorine dioxide with a PAA rinse. So you're rinsing it with the PAA. We've seen that. So people are using in combination as well. So I guess my answer would be, yes, it could be a concern, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, you know, they have to use different products. And then the farmers who believe sanitizers are bad, you know, again, then they need to find a buyer who will buy it unwashed, I guess, if that's, you know, where they stand. Because again, I think I promote it, how you can get growers to buy in, as you say, is from a shelf life side too, right? You're increasing the shelf life of this product by reducing some of these spoilage bacteria, and therefore their product lasts longer so they can get it to market. So I think sometimes when you present it like that, it makes it less, I don't know what the right word, less undesirable to growers who feel that way. But it's up to them. You know, if they don't, then they need to just find somebody who will buy it unwashed.
All right, thanks for answering those questions. I tried to tie them together to get a 2-for-1, and it was a big question there. So I see there's a bunch more here. So I know we're getting close to time, and I think we should get to a couple more. This is an interesting one. For one person says, one PAA product, Shield Bright, says it can be used from 30 to 300 parts per million on the label. But then FDA in CFR Part 173.315 says PAA should not exceed 80 parts per million in fruit and vegetable wash water. Do you have any reason for this difference?
So I would suggest, so that big range, was that specifically for fruit and vegetable? So typically on food contact surfaces, they're going to be able to use a much higher concentration. But when it's in a fruit and vegetable wash, 80 parts per million is pretty typical from just from the labels that I've looked at, that they're going to run in that range. So maybe, and I'm not saying I'm not familiar with that product, but it could be that higher parts per million was for a food contact surface or to sanitize, say, drains or something like that. But I don't know. Like I said, I haven't looked at that. I'm not familiar with that particular product.
Okay. I think we'll do one more question from the chat box, and then I'll collect all of these questions. And if you're willing to, you know, answer some of those outside of this call, Amanda, then I can put them in the notes and get them out to everybody else. I just know that we're running tight on time. We're already at 3 o'clock, and Donna had a couple things that she wanted to share. So I was going to get to one more question here. And that one actually I had some questions about too, was about your essential oil slide that you shared. And I believe this is Billy Mitchell says, I think I understood one of your slides to say that some essential oils are effective sanitizers. If yes, if a grower wants to use an essential oil, do you know where to find scientific research to back that up? And have you heard of a grower passing a GAPS audit using an essential oil as their sanitizer?
So no, I haven't. I don't know of anybody actually running an essential oil. So if it is just, so it would not have an EPA label, right? Because that would be one of those 30 that they don't have to be registered with EPA. Not necessarily are they all good sanitizers. If you look in the literature though, there has been some research. So though people are combining, say, mint oil with something else, and they are showing some log reductions. I mean, they're not great, but they are showing some. But I have not seen anybody, and maybe some of you guys have though, I have not seen anybody using it in the packing house or pass an audit using that. But I wouldn't see, as long as they're doing it the way it should be. I mean, I don't see why not, but I have not seen that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for answering those questions. I see there were a couple more that are in the chat box. I'll put those in the notes, and if we can get to them, we will absolutely follow up with those questions. But we appreciate everyone's participation, and especially Amanda for spending the time today for her presentation and answering some of these challenging questions. Before we hop off the line, I wanted to turn it over to Donna, who has a couple of quick updates from some resources that the PSA has developed, one new one, and then an update to one that we've had out there for a while now. So Donna, you on?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Excellent. So I will be very brief with this. I just wanted to quickly highlight a couple of sanitizer resources that we have up on the Produce Safety Alliance website. So this slide here just kind of shows you where you can find those resources, because those of you who are familiar with the PSA website, you probably know that we list resources in two main areas. The one is the general resource listing, which is really applicable for growers, educators, kind of all of the above. And then the other resource listing is for trainers and trainer resources. So the two resources that we have currently available on the PSA website are under the sanitation section. And the first one is a new fact sheet that just went up last week. And this is titled Selecting an EPA Labeled Sanitizer. Thank you, Gretchen. And this goes actually a lot into some detail about a lot of the topics that Amanda covered on this phone call. Things that a grower should look for in a sanitizer label. If you were from a particular state and wanted to create kind of like a state-specific sanitizer list, much like what Amanda talked about that she has done for Indiana, there are some visuals of the National Pesticide Information Retrieval website and some visuals on how you might be able to make your own state-specific list. And this is more of an educator-centric fact sheet, but I think it could be helpful for growers as well. But this fact sheet, as well as a lot of the information that Amanda covered throughout this webinar, really covers a lot of the questions that I have when I first started teaching post-harvest water, that module, and when I first started working with growers and sanitizers. Gretchen, you can go to the next slide. And then this second tool is what we call the labeled sanitizers for produce, and this is all about EPA labeling. It does not go into FDA GRAS sanitizers or products. And this fact sheet the original version was published, I think, in 2016 on the PSA website. And this tool really came about when we would get the question, growers would call us and say, we're using dollar store bottle bleach and our GAPS auditor told us we could not use it anymore. What should I use? So we started populating this Excel file. There is a video tutorial, so if anybody who has not used this Excel file tool before, I highly, highly recommend walking through, I think it's a 7-minute long video tutorial on YouTube that walks through how to use this tool. But this has recently been updated. We're calling it version 2.0. I updated it in September, and we added a few additional EPA labels, ones that people notified me of. There were a number of, label updates that we included. And Gretchen, if you flip to the next page, the other thing that was updated in this version 2.0 is a single product sheet. And for example, if you open up this tool and you want to find all of the information you can on Sanidate 5.0, you can flip to this page, choose it from the drop down, and it kind of summarizes all of the information on the tool. One of the things I want to mention about this tool is that we do not interpret anything. So really what this resource does is it lists a number of EPA labeled sanitizers, and then I link directly to that label. So we try very hard not to interpret anything. But just as Amanda mentioned on her webinar, it's still very complicated. So I always recommend, even if you find a sanitizer that you are interested, always click and go through to that EPA label to read it directly from the source. And Gretchen, if you click to the next sheet, this is just my call out that I am always looking for new sanitizers to add to this resource. So if there are any that you do not see listed in the sheet, please send them on to me, and my email address is right there. And I will say that I've had probably 20 sent to me over the last couple of years, and I would say 8 times out of 10, it's a label that is already included with the federal name on the spreadsheet already, which just as Amanda was talking about, a lot of them are like state-specific names. So, but if you send me those names, I will definitely look into adding it to the resource. And that's all.
Okay. Thank you so much, Donna, for highlighting those resources. I believe Don dropped in the chat box where you can access those resources on our website. I'd like to open it up for one last opportunity. Amanda, do you have anything else to share before we close out the call?
No, I'm good. No,
Hey,
I'm
Gretchen.
those questions that are in the text box or the chat box, sorry.
Hey, Gretchen, can I make a really quick comment?
Sure.
I forgot to mention this when I did my spiel, but there was a question earlier, I think that used Sanidate 5.0 and 12.0 as an example. Those are both listed on this Excel file. So what I did is I pulled up the Excel file, clicked on label information, and then just scrolled through. And as Amanda mentioned, the main difference between the two is the concentration of peroxyacetic acid that makes up, the dilution. But there are some labeling differences. So I don't want to quote it, but Sanidate 12, it looks like, is not labeled for the same exact purposes that Sanidate 5 is. And I'm sure it's due to the whole dilution thing, but that's just my callback to make sure you always read the label, because there are some differences even among things with just different dilutions.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks again to Amanda for joining us for today's call, and for Donna sharing and updating that resource. I know we've received a lot of positive feedback on the sanitizers spreadsheet, as well as the fact sheet that we just developed. We are going to have our next meeting on December 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And if you guys missed it, FDA released their draft guidance to the produce safety rule last week. So we are planning to have a discussion about the produce safety rule draft guidance on that date. I will send out the meeting information, including the link to the Zoom meeting and the call-in, a little bit closer to the call. And as usual, I'll send out notes and the recording to this meeting, and I'll share some of your questions that were in the chat box that we couldn't get to with Amanda, and we'll try to answer some of those for you. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone from the PSA team for being on the call today, and hope that you will join us for the December 17th call. All right, take care, everyone, and have a good afternoon.